It's obvious. You don't have to be some kind of political scientist to see what's going on here. Putin doesn't want. He's never altered his position 1 millimeter. His position is total surrender of Ukraine. And the only strange thing about this is that Donald Trump kept on repeating during his campaign that he was going to resolve this war in one day. And so he put his neck out, and now all of a sudden he's looking kind of stupid. And so he's trying to find ways of looking less so, but it's not working very well, and Putin is not giving him any opportunity.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Sir Bill Browder, the CEO and founder of Hermitage Capital Management and a man who has been campaigning against Kremlin oppression and injustice since he was banned from Russia for exposing corruption in 2005. Bill Browder, thank you very much for joining us today.
Great to be here.
What have you made from what we have heard so far about the phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? TASS news agency is reporting that Russia is ready to work on a memorandum on a future peace deal in Ukraine. Is that enough?
It's nothing. I mean, this is typical Kremlin rope-a-dope, which is just keep on talking about more engagement, talk about more meetings, talk about memorandums, talk about conditional ceasefires, but basically don't do what you need to do. I mean, basically, it's very simple. Putin invaded Ukraine in February 2022. It's his soldiers that are trying to take territory. If he wants to have peace, it's very simple. Just stop invading. And so all this conditional ceasefires based on memorandums is just a load of nonsense. This is just a way of delaying and prevaricating. And of course, he doesn't want to say to Donald Trump, no, because if he says that, it makes Donald Trump look bad. And so he throws out all this nonsense to try to keep the process going so that he doesn't have to stop what he's doing.
And that call has just finished as we're talking now, so I expect there may well be more updates on it as we have this discussion. But one of the things that was floated before that call started was the idea that Trump wants to have some sort of in-person conversation with Vladimir Putin. Who do you think will be more worried about a Putin-Trump in-person meeting, Kiev or the Kremlin?
Obviously Kiev, because it's very simple. What Trump is trying to do right now is end the war. The only way to end the war from his perspective is to force Ukraine to surrender, because Russia is not going to stop. And so whatever is discussed in a bilateral meeting between Trump and Putin is not going to be in Ukraine's interest. And so one can only hope that Trump decides not to have that meeting, because all the best that can happen is status quo, and the worst that can happen is some type of ugly cutoff of military aid from the United States, or some type of cutoff of intelligence, or lifting of sanctions, or some other thing which doesn't help Ukraine and helps Putin.
And I want to just quickly read a quote from Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, if you'll allow me, who was speaking earlier today. He said that if US mediation helps achieve the goals of the special military operation by peaceful means, Russia would prefer this. Do you think that is any basis for any sort of ceasefire, even the one that Trump has proposed?
Let me just translate that into plain English. He's saying that if Trump's involvement allows Russia to dominate Ukraine and force their surrender without fighting, then he'd be very happy.
And Putin's reportedly quite confident going into this phone call about Russia's standing in the wider conflict in Ukraine. But should he be confident about the impact that this war is going to have on Russia in the longer term?
He shouldn't be confident about anything. And in his heart of heart, he's not confident. Russia has lost close to 1 million soldiers now, either from death or permanent disability. The economy is in a state of apoplexy because of this. The Russian people can't travel to most of the Western world. Russian industry has basically had to completely reorient itself towards the war because nobody buys their stuff anymore. And so I don't see how this is anything other than an abject disaster for Russia and for the Russian people. The main thing that Putin has going for him is that he doesn't care what the Russian people think because he's a dictator. It doesn't matter whether they love him or hate him because there's no election that's going to remove him. And therefore, he can inflict literally 100 times the pain on the Russian people than we would be able to experience in the West without a change of regime. And so he's just busy out there saying, I'm confident because I can make the Russian people suffer so profoundly that your minor suffering will be worse for you than my major suffering for me because I don't care.
So in that case, should Putin be concerned about the threats that have been made about further US sanctions and secondary sanctions on people buying Russian oil?
Well, that would be very concerning for Putin if he thought that was going to happen. The problem is that there's a big disconnect between the people who have come up with that and the people who are making the decisions. So if you look at whose idea that is, that comes from Lindsey Graham, who's a Republican and a close ally of Donald Trump, and it's a bipartisan piece of legislation which is also supported by the Democrats. But Donald Trump has constantly run interference for Putin since he's come into power. He has basically apologized for him on numerous occasions when he hasn't done what everybody expected Putin to do. And so there's no reason to expect that all of a sudden Trump is going to change his mind and become tough on Putin. It would be great if he did. It would actually end the war sooner if all of a sudden Russia wasn't able to get the money from their oil. That would end the conflict. But Trump is so desperately trying to keep relations good with Putin that he's ready to sell Ukraine out in the process.
And on the matter of oil and oil prices, I mean, we know that the price of oil has been dropping since the start of the year. That's presumably going to be concerning for people in the Kremlin who are trying to keep Russia's war economy afloat.
Well, it's ironic. On one hand, Trump is trying to help Putin wherever he can. On the other hand, his big tariff announcement caused the oil price to drop, and the oil price adversely affects Putin in a very serious way because that's really their lifeline. If Russia is unable to sell oil at a high price, the revenues that they get are diminished, and then they can't use it for their war. Of course, we could, if we really wanted to, in the West, we could cut them off completely, cut them off from the markets completely, and I think they probably have 6 to 9 months of runway before they just run out of money.
And President Zelensky is reportedly going to now be having his own phone conversation with Donald Trump. They also apparently spoke briefly before the call with Putin. What have you been encouraged at all by the slight warming of relations between the White House and Zelensky? I mean, we heard that he's had another meeting with JD Vance today, which has gone a lot better than his previous meeting at the White House. Is there anything that Kiev should see positively in that?
Well, we're starting at a very low base. The base is the Oval Office meeting in which Donald Trump and JD Vance shrieked at Zelensky as if it was somehow the war was somehow his fault when he was the victim. That shameful meeting, and so everything is a vast improvement over that. But I think that also Zelensky is just a master diplomat, and he's doing whatever he can to sort of navigate this truly humiliating, untenable situation in a very impressive and I would say mature way. Which, if I was subjected to that kind of treatment, I don't think I would have the stamina or the stature to be able to rise up above it the way he has.
And what would you like to see come out of this phone call with Zelensky and Trump? And what sort of stuff do you think Zelensky should be reiterating to Trump?
Well, the obvious thing that we would like to see come out of this phone call is Trump doubling down on weapons supplies for Ukraine and doubling down, tripling down on sanctions against Russia, in particular, sanctioning Russian oil. That would be the ideal outcome. That would be the outcome which everybody in the other allied countries want. That's surely the outcome that the European Union and Keir Starmer want. Uh, but again, we've not seen any move in that direction. We see everything he does and says suggests that he's on Putin's side.
And and on that worrying note, I mean, JD Vance has today reiterated that the US could walk away from this conflict entirely, but Putin's been pretty clear about who he sees as the enemy in this conflict, and it's not just Ukraine. Can the US realistically just wash its hands of this?
Well, the U.S. Has the capacity to do whatever they want to do. They could stop supplying military aid to Ukraine. They could stop supplying intelligence to Ukraine. They could move U.S. NATO soldiers from bordering countries from Ukraine. There's a lot of things that the U.S. could do, which would be adverse to the Ukrainian interests. And what does he mean by walking away? Does it mean they're walking away from these peace negotiations, or does it mean they're walking away from Ukraine? And it's hard to know from all this language, other than to look at what these people have said over a long period of time. JD Vance was very explicit. He said, "I don't care about Ukraine," in his campaign. We saw his conduct in the Oval Office meeting. And so I don't think that there's any reason to be optimistic about how the U.S. is going to behave. But it's also volatile, that anything can happen, and maybe something good will happen. But I wouldn't bet on it.
And what did you make of the talks over the weekend that were supposed to include possibly Putin and Trump, but in the end, of course, it was just this smaller delegation of Russians who appeared. Did you see anything in that was positive?
Not a thing. So I mean, let's look at the chronology. Putin made an announcement saying that he's ready to negotiate with Ukraine. So then Trump leaned on Zelensky and said, I urge you to negotiate. And so Zelensky said, even though there's we're not going to negotiate until there's a declared ceasefire. He decided to go anyways, and so he shows up in Istanbul, and lo and behold, Putin doesn't show up. And not only does he not show up, he sends a group of nobodies to this negotiation. I mean, it's just as plain as day that Putin has no interest in peace. That's the bottom line here, and everything else that happens is just in one way or another giving him more flexibility and more latitude on that position. But it's obvious that what needs to happen is Russia needs to declare an unconditional 30-day ceasefire, as Ukraine has, and then there should be real negotiations. And that's the only way that this will get solved. I seriously doubt whether that's going to happen. And I also seriously doubt whether, even if there were such negotiations, that Russia would negotiate in good faith, because they never have before.
And on these negotiations, it's been pretty clear now from the West, and especially from the White House, that they want Putin to do this in person. They want him to sit down with Zelensky to get to a peace deal here. Why do you think Putin is so afraid, seemingly, of face-to-face talks with Zelensky?
Well, because he doesn't want to be humiliated, and he would be the one getting humiliated if Zelensky shows up and said, "I'm ready to do this, this, and this," and then it becomes clear that Putin's ready to do nothing, which is, by the way, the position that this group of nobodies presented in Istanbul. This group of nobodies showed up and said, "Our negotiating position is that Ukraine should withdraw from their own territory." Of course, they're not going to withdraw from their own territory. It's absurd.
And you mentioned earlier that we've seen continuing efforts in the US Congress, at least, to bring further sanctions against Russia. And there's been some form of continued support in the form of Patriot missiles, which have been supplied to help the stop the ongoing airstrikes, especially on Kiev, but across Ukraine. Is there enough going on in the US outside of the White House that could ferment into meaningful support for Ukraine?
Well, I think that that's the only reason that Ukraine continues to have whatever U.S. support there is because there's a lot of people in the Republican Party and the Republican Congress and the Senate who are very strongly supporting Ukraine. People like Lindsey Graham, Roger Wicker, both Republicans, who are very strongly on Ukraine's side. And Trump, while his personal feeling is towards Putin, he can't completely alienate all of his allies.
And we're getting more details now of this phone call between President Trump and President Putin. As far as we can tell, the Russians Putin has not made any further concessions at all. How long can this go on where the US continues to push for a ceasefire and the Kremlin simply stonewalls? And what does it tell us? At what point will it become clear to people who have taken a softer line on the Kremlin, do you think, that there really is no ceasefire coming just around the corner?
The point would be like a year ago. It's obvious. There's no, you don't have to be some kind of political scientist to see what's going on here. Putin doesn't want. He's never altered his position 1 millimeter. His position is total surrender of Ukraine. And the only strange thing about this is that Donald Trump kept on repeating during his campaign that he was going to resolve this war in 1 day. And so he put his neck out, and now all of a sudden he's looking kind of stupid. And so he's trying to find ways of looking less so, but it's not working very well. And Putin is not giving him any opportunity.
Well, in the meantime, the European Union has said it is going to move ahead with sanctions that it threatened last week. Do you think Europe has done enough to provide that disincentive for Russia to continue this war?
No, I don't think so. I think that Russia continues to be able to sell their oil. As long as they can sell their oil, they can continue to afford this war. Europe has left that carved out, and that's the main loophole which Putin is exploiting. And so, if Europe wants to really end the war, the best way to do it is to cut off their ability to sell their oil. And Europe has great capacity there in terms of their own sanctions program, and hopefully now that will be implemented.
And do you think there is going to be any movement on the use of those frozen Russian assets as well?
It's really hard to say. It's the obvious thing to do. There's $300 billion of Russian frozen assets. Ukraine needs resources to fight the war. Russia has done more than $1 trillion of damage to Ukraine. And so it's obvious that Ukraine should get that money. I'm actually going to be in Brussels tomorrow at the EU in the European Parliament to do a big event to push for the confiscation of those assets. But the Europeans have to make these decisions by unanimous consent. They basically have to have every country agree to keep that money frozen, first of all, and then secondly, to confiscate that money. And there are people inside the European Union, like Viktor Orban of Hungary and Fico of the Slovakia, who are now sort of fully aligned with Putin. And so it's not such an easy thing to get stuff done in the European Union. But it seems to me that's probably the most important thing that can be done in terms of changing the course of this war is confiscating that money.
And you mentioned there the opposition to taking a more harder line against Russia that is still there in Europe. What did you make of the outcome of the Romanian elections just yesterday? And how does that reflect how cautious we need to be of sort of pro-Kremlin candidates, essentially, in European elections?
Well, so Putin and his KGB operatives are trying to foment political discontent everywhere they can, and they're ready to invest in doing that. And they're doing it all over the world. And in Romania, they put forth a candidate and then ran a whole campaign using TikTok and Instagram and any other social media they could find. And they found a candidate who was sort of a MAGA candidate for Romania. And thankfully, the Romanian people rejected that. And they would reject that in what I would describe as a landslide. It was 54 to 46, which is, the numbers of a landslide, because the Romanian people, in very large numbers, voted against it. They don't want to be part of Russia again. And so, and by the way, this is not the first time that they've failed. They failed in Moldova. They've failed in all sorts of places all over Europe. And so I think that they have evil intentions. They're ready to invest in their evil intentions, but rational people don't want Russia to be, dictating terms in their country.
And following on from that, I mean, President Trump wants to try and make out that this seems to be a move towards peace, but the threat on the ground even in Europe is still there, isn't it? From Russian agents, Russian cells, the threat of assassination or other sabotage campaigns. That's still a very real threat in Europe, isn't it?
Yeah, so Russia is currently at war, not just with Ukraine, but at war with Europe. And when I say at war, they're in a hybrid war with Europe. And what that means is sabotage. They're cutting internet cables. They're blowing up train depots. They're trying to put bombs on airplanes. They're assassinating dissidents and other people, or attempting to assassinate them. They're running PR trolling campaigns throughout different elections, and that's their action. And by the way, and it will escalate if they succeed. If Russia succeeds in Ukraine, then they'll make their move on other places. And their hope is that we're in such a sort of transactional world now that if NATO needs to come to the defense of one country, it may not. That the United States may not. That other countries then may say, if the United States is not involved, we don't want to be involved. And that's the bet Putin is making right now.
Well, Bill Browder, CEO and founder of Hermitage Capital Management and human rights campaigner, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can sign up for membership at the link below or subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.